now. Start the webinar. Let's get started. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us on a Friday afternoon. But I know in some parts of the country the weather's not the best and it's raining. So, you know, in light of not actually being fishing, the only second best thing is to be talking about fishing. And I'm joined by Andy Burnett and Shane O'Reilly from Inland Fisheries Ireland, who have been an invaluable resource to the Men's Sheds Association. And this is our third Shedcast in relation to fishing, and we're focusing specifically on coarse angling. I'll let Andy talk about that and everything about that, and Shane in a minute, but I just want to say thanks very much to the two guys for giving us their time today and for their continued support of their team in the inland fisheries. So over to you, Andy. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Frank. How's things?
Good.
Like you said, is my colleague Shane's going to be joining me on this one. We're just going to run through the basics of coarse fishing, what it's all about, and the different avenues that people can take within coarse fishing itself, because it's not kind of all eggs fit into one basket, so to speak. So yeah, with that we'll crack on. And if anyone's got any questions, just fire away and I'll answer them as best I can, or Shane will. So coarse angling, it's a very old term, came about back in the very early 19th century. The term originally referred to any fish that was not of the game fishing variety, because they weren't seen as palatable. Therefore, the gentry of the time gave them the term coarse fish. But thankfully, times have moved on a bit from that now. And now coarse fishing is just used to describe any other freshwater angling other than game fishing. Comes under the coarse fishing bracket. Pike fishing does have its own kind of bracket there, but it still comes within the coarse fishing fraternity. And of course, as you know, Frank, and as you know as well, Shane, we're very, very lucky here in Ireland that the inland waterways that we have are absolutely brimming with tons and tons of different species of coarse fish, in massive numbers, for us all to enjoy and go out and catch a few. The coarse angling in Ireland it's that good that, well, you can tell I don't have an Irish accent, so it drew me here from many, many miles away, and does continue to do so, has done for well over 60 years, draws anglers from all over the world, as far as away as New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, lots of people coming from the UK and Europe as well, like on a yearly basis. I think kind of what it generally tends to be is once the wives let people come over for an angling holiday, it tends to turn into a yearly thing then, you know, because the lads will put it into the budget for the year. So certainly that was the way it happened with me before I moved over.
Yeah. It's one of the most accessible types of fishing too, isn't it, Andy? I mean, you don't need to, for in most cases, you don't need a permit or anything like that. You don't need a whole lot of expensive gear. I know you have a lot of expensive gear because you do it. You know, you're a fanatic, but to get going in it, you don't need a whole lot. It's probably the easiest type of fishing to get into, really, isn't it?
It is definitely. I mean, literally, you can start with something as simple as a piece of cane and almost a bent pin. You know, a hook, a piece of line, a few maggots, and a stick, and you're away. You can start fishing, and that's often the way that we start teaching people, is with what we call the whip method, and it literally is that. It's just a short carbon pole, hook and line and float, a few maggots, and you can start fishing. So it's a very inexpensive, like Shane says, very accessible way. And another good thing about the coarse angling as well, it doesn't matter from the age of 2 to 102, anybody can get involved, you know, and we're always working on improving access to angling spots, particularly for anybody that's less able-bodied. We're always working on disabled angling stands, and certainly we get letters in every year about, you know, improving access, and we're trying to work on that all the time.
Brilliant.
So there's lots and lots of different benefits to angling. As it says there, everybody gets something different from a day on the water. For me, it's just, I find for my mental health, it's absolutely paramount. When I'm out on the water, I don't think about anything else for that time when I'm there. The whole world just kind of pales into insignificance. I'm concentrating on that water, I'm fishing, I'm enjoying myself, I'm relaxed, and it's almost an escapism. So I think it's very, very good that way. Can be good physically as well. There's lots and lots of physical activity if you want there to be. Lots of lads will go trudging off the beaten track and walk 6, 7, 8 fields across to a tiny little lake to go and find that specimen fish of a lifetime. Me, I have far too much gear to do that. I like to park up and roll out my car onto my peg. But yeah, it brings something different for everybody. I think is the biggest thing that I like to get across with fishing. I don't know what you would say about that, Shane.
Yeah, well, for me, I just love being out in the outdoors, in the nature and all of that. And it doesn't matter whether it's slashing rain or whether the sun is shining or whatever. There's always something going on around you. Even if the fish aren't biting, there's something natural. There's birds, there's animals, there's all of that. And if you have an office job, which I have for most of the time, just getting out in that and spending a good number of hours outdoors. When you come back in of an evening, you feel so much better. I think, that's just what it does to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. Like you say, particularly about the nature side of things, I think as an angler, you tend to see a lot more of nature than anybody would do, generally speaking. The general public see very little of nature in out in the countryside, so to speak. But there'd be often times when we'd be sat there at water's edge. Mink would be coming across. There could be pine martens running up and down the bank. You might see young fox cubs out playing. A deer could, stroll past at the other side of the lake or whatever. You just see some really, really nice sights. So that's one of the big benefits. And you can see there, I'm sat on a nice quiet lake that's just down the road, maybe about 10 minutes from my house. It's an absolutely brilliant tench water. We've got some good fishing on there last year.
You'll have to tell me about that one, Andy.
I'll have to put you on that, Shane. Yeah, it's that secret one that Kevin came with the photography.
Oh
yeah. There's lots of different types of coarse fishing. Many different avenues that people can go down. It's pleasure fishing, which is basically just, as it sounds, just going out for purely the pleasure of fishing and enjoying time on the bank. There's match or competition angling, which, as it says there, that's my personal favourite and has been for the past several years. I've done many different avenues of coarse fishing, but that seems to be the one that at the moment I've got the bug for. Specimen angling. There's a lot of people into specimen angling. Would you be a bit of a specimen angler yourself, Shane?
I wouldn't really be a specimen angler at all, no. I would have caught some specimen fish, all right. I think I've only ever claimed one of them. And I suppose I've always been an aspiring specimen angler, but I've never, you have to be pretty dedicated to be chasing down particular venues, and you have to put a fair bit of work into it. And yeah, I'm much more of a pleasure angler of the three that you've listed there. I just go out to enjoy it. I've never really been a competition fisher, and while I have enjoyed targeting larger fish, I wouldn't regard myself as a specimen angler, no.
Yeah.
And just for the uninitiated, sorry to interrupt, Andy, specimen angling, what would the definition of that be?
So that would be people that are going out and specifically targeting larger species or larger fish within a certain species. So generally speaking, pike fishing tends to be a big one where people will switch from just being a pike angler to a specimen pike angler. So they'll go just chasing big fish. Carp fishing tends to be another one. Tench fishing is now a big one over here. The tench fishers, that's very, very popular. Like a specimen size tench is £6, but regularly, we're hearing of fish that are in excess of £7.5, which for Ireland is a huge fish. And we're getting them every year now. So the more lads that switch to it, the better people are getting at it, And then there's... Go on, sorry.
I was just going to say there's a thing called the Irish Specimen Fish Committee, which establishes a weight or a length for each fish species. And as Andy said, for tench, it's £6. So if you catch a tench of £6 or over, it's considered to be a specimen tench. And if you submit a claim into the Specimen Fish Committee, you actually get a certificate and an award at an award ceremony every year. So some people, you know, put a lot of effort into that, and they might pick up 6 or 7 or 8 awards a year or more even. Other people, if you're like me, to get an award, you know, is, you know, maybe a once in a lifetime thing. You know, it's an achievement of having targeted and caught a fish of a particular size. So it's a great incentive.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, thanks.
But I mean, having said all that, on the different sort of avenues of coarse fishing, and there's other avenues within it as well, my personal suggestion to anybody who's new to it is just to get out on the bank, try and catch lots of different species of fish on lots of different methods, at lots of different venues. Then what that kind of does is it makes you a better all-round angler, gives you a better understanding of fish behavior, water cycles, weather patterns, conditions on how fish feed and all that sort of stuff. So definitely, if you're just getting into coarse fishing, just try and get out and catch a fish, you know, on as many different venues as you can do. Concentrate on one method to start with. And once you think that you've mastered that, my advice is look up YouTube, because there's new methods coming on every week. There's lots and lots and lots of different videos, and there's lots of information and little tiny tweaks to your rigs and your methods that you're using, and your feeding patterns are very important. And it's the little tiny tweaks that make the big difference when you're out on the bank. You can go from literally believing that there's not a fish in front of you and the smallest of changes, and you'll be into fish every single cast. So it's just finding out what them fish want on the day. So for today, we're going to kind of concentrate on more of the basic type of stuff, which is primarily float fishing on lakes, rivers and canals, and feeder fishing, which most people over here tend to start with feeder fishing. We'll also touch a little bit on pole fishing too. So I'll just put a bit in about baits there. So as you can see, lots of bright, wonderful, different coloured. I normally get squirms and stuff as soon as we start getting bait out on the bank when I'm out with groups, because nobody wants to touch the maggots or the worms and stuff, you know. But yeah, it's just to kind of run through the basics of what we use. We need different baits in order to catch different fish. These come in lots of different shapes and sizes and smells. We've got lots of natural baits like maggots, casters, worms. Casters are the chrysalis form of the common blue bottle. So the maggot is the larvae of the common blue bottle. That's what we'd use as bait on the hook. And then the casters are the chrysalis form of that. And they're a really good fish attracting bait. So if you're out roach fishing or bream fishing, for instance, or tench, there's nothing that them fish love better than to be crunching up casters, because they have a crunchy shell on the outside and then like a soft inner. And they're a really good fish pulling bait. We also use worms and hemp seed. That's just to name a few. There's all sorts of other seeds and pulses that we use as well. And then there's also stuff that is man-made, such as boilies, and then we have fake flavoured baits and stuff. And they're used usually to attract bigger fish. So a lot of the specimen lads would be using boilies, fish meal pellets, all that sort of stuff, and they would be obviously your man-made baits. But for most coarse angling situations, for most newbies, it's pretty basic. Some worms maybe, ground bait, and a few maggots, and away you go. Like, you know, you don't need to be spending a lot of money on bait. A pint of maggots in a fishing tackle shop, depending on where you are in the country, can cost from as little as €3.5 up to maybe €5 or €6. A bag of ground bait again is about €5, and that'll pretty much get you on your way. Ground bait, all that is it's a mix of breadcrumbs, ground up seeds, sometimes ground up nuts, biscuit crumb, all with different flavors and different properties in it. What it allows you to do is when you mix it with water, it allows you to form balls with it, and that's basically carries your loose feed, so your particles, your hemp seed, your sweet corn, your maggots, your casters. You mix that into your mix, form balls, and that allows you to throw your bait further out into the lake than you would be able to get if you were just throwing it out loosely by hand. So you can throw the balls out. It allows you to fish to deeper water, allows you to attract bigger fish into the area. So that's the idea, really, is you're trying to create competition in your swim for them bigger fish to come in and then feed on that.
Yeah, that's the whole idea of ground bait, is to attract fish into the swim, and because as Andy said, there's all sorts of fancy smells and stuff like that you can put into it that will attract fish in. So if you an area of water in front of you, you might have X amount of fish, but when you start putting ground bait in, sometimes the disturbance of the balls hitting the water and then the smell as it breaks up, suddenly the fish take interest and they start coming into the area that you're fishing in. And the idea is then that you're able to keep them in that area and catch more fish, I suppose.
Yeah. Like Shane was saying there, with it, there's so many different ground baits on the markets now. It can be very confusing for the beginner. But most tackle shops will be very good, and they'll give you what would you call a general mix. So if you're going to, say for instance, around here, if you were going on the River Shannon, you went into one of the local tackle shops, you told them you were going on the Shannon, there would be a mix that they'd give you that they know would cover you for that situation, you know. And then it can also depend on how you mix the ball, how much water you put into the ground bait depends on what you get out at the end of the mix. So as it says there, if you're fishing really deep water, you want something that's going to hold a lot of particles and is going to go straight down to the bottom without breaking up. So you want it to release the feed on the bottom to concentrate the fish there. So therefore, what you'd use is quite a sticky mix. So it would have some binder in it, but you'd also wet your ground bait slightly, overly wet your ground bait so that it sticks together really, really firmly in a ball. Squeeze that ball really hard. That'll go down like a rock and break up nice and slowly on the bottom and release food periodically and create a nice scent trail down the river. Whereas if you're fishing in a shallow lake, obviously if you mix a rock hard ball and throw it into 3 foot of water in a shallow lake, it's going to be no use to you because it's not breaking down fast enough. The fish are coming in, there's nothing coming off the ball, so there's nothing there to attract them. So what we use there is a softer, fluffier mix. So you make a much drier mix of ground bait, and it just about squeezes and holds into a ball. And when you throw that out into the water, as soon as it contacts with the water, it immediately breaks up and forms a cloud in that water column, and that just forms a load of small food particles to be coming through the water. So that attracts all the fish in. So it's just a case of getting to know what the different ground baits do, but that all comes with time. You know, like I say, really, if you're going somewhere when you're starting out, speak to your tackle dealer. They'll be able to tell you what sort of mix you're going to need for where you're going. So we'll go into a bit of float fishing now. My experience of it is when I've come across novices with float fishing, everybody thinks they know, oh, float fishing, it's dead simple. You just stick a float on the line, watch it. When it goes under, you lift up, you've got a fish. As you can see from that, that's just a very small selection of my pole floats. I would probably have somewhere in the region of maybe 800 to 1,000 floats. And that's just to cover every single eventuality that I can think of when I'm out. So if I turn up to a match and I'm faced with a river that's in flood, for instance, and I need to put a big heavy float on with lots of weight that keeps my bait right down near the bottom, I can set up what we call a flat float, which is, just pull this one out here, just show you. And these will allow you to put lots and lots of weight down the line and put your bait, basically tickle your bait through the swim in front of the big fish. That's a flat float. Now, they don't look anything like them floats that are on the screen. They're kind of a specialist job. You can see there, the actual profile of them is very, very thin. But what they do is they sit in the flow and the water actually goes around them.
Yeah.
So they allow you to sit dead stable. So you get away with actually using less lead down your line to keep your float still and hold it back against the flow. If you were to use a float with, say, a big round body like that, you would have to use probably the equivalent of 4 times the amount of lead that you would have to put on that. You would have to put on this. in order to get the same presentation. So it's just with the floats, it's all down to just covering different eventualities. And like I say, that's for pole fishing. Wagler fishing is completely different. Generally speaking, we use 3 different types of wagglers over here. We use bodied wagglers, insert wagglers, and straight wagglers. Bodied wagglers, you can see there on the screen, they have like a bulbous body at the bottom. And what they give you is a lot of stability. So if you're fishing a big open wild loch and you're fishing at 25, 30 meters range, and there's a big chop on the water, that allows you to undershot that float and allows you to have plenty of float sticking up out of the water so that you can see it at that range, but it also keeps your bait nice and still under the water, because they take a lot of, sorry, pardon me, they have a lot of shotting capacity on them. So it allows you to put plenty of weight down that line to keep that bait nice and still in front of the fish. The insert wagglers there, which you can see in the middle, they tend to be for much shallower water, shyer biting fish, for fishing through the water levels. So if you're fishing for the small fish, roach, hybrids, perch, that sort of thing, that's the type of float you'd use for that. And straight wagglers with the thicker tip tend to be for running water. Slow moving rivers like the Shannon is ideal for waggler fishing. And what that allows you to do, it allows you to just drag the bait slightly on the bottom as the flow's running through. If you have a little bit of line just sort of dragging behind the float on the bottom, because they've got a nice buoyant tip on them, you undershot that float slightly, it just allows it to trip over the bottom and pulls the bait through behind the float, which gives a nice slower presentation than the natural flow.
And just in case you've frightened anyone by telling them you have 1,000 floats, I have about 30 or 40 floats, and I get on just fine with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just a bit of a what's known in the trade as a tackle tart.
Tackle tart, very good. Yeah.
So yeah, as I've just been explaining there, waggler fishing, it was developed as a modified float fishing method. And basically it was to allow you to be able to sink the line between the rod tip and the float, because that allows you, previous to that, what was invented first of all, float fishing, was what's called toppers, or top and bottom floats, and they're attached to the line top and bottom by float rubbers. But what you can't do when you're using the top and bottom float is you cannot sink the line to the float, because it will always pop back up on the surface. So if you've got very windy conditions, what that naturally does is blows a big bow of line behind your float, which then pulls your float offline. So it doesn't allow natural presentation. So the fish looks at that maggot going through at twice the pace of the flow and goes, oh, I'm not taking that, you know. So it's just a way of being able to present a bait properly to a fish. With a waggler float, it's just threaded straight onto the line. There's normally an eye at the bottom of the float. Thread your line straight through, and we use either float stops or locking shot either side of the float to hold the float in place. And then we can plumb the swim up. We use lead plummets to plumb the swim. All that is a heavier lead weight, so 20, 30 grams with an eye at the top, piece of cork at the bottom. We pass the hook through the eye, hook it into the cork at the bottom, and then swing that out into the lake or the river. If the float goes under the weight of the plummet, that means that the float is set too shallow, so we need to move the float up the line. And then once you've got the float, once your float is actually set and you can see it on the surface when the plummet's on the bottom, that tells you that you're fishing at the correct depth. You're actually on the bottom. What we always do is we'll work from the bottom up. So I'd always start in the bottom third of the water column. So I may not start completely on the bottom. If I'm in very deep water, I might start, say, a foot off bottom or 18 inches off bottom, because you'll always find that, generally speaking, your fish are always in or around the bottom of the water column because they're looking for that food, you know. So that was a very quick way of explaining plumbing up. It's kind of hard to explain. It's much easier to show people in person with the plumbing up.
Yeah.
So that's waggler fishing. Anything you want to add there, Shane?
No, I just say that finding the depth is something that sometimes people overlook when they're beginning fishing, you know, because they just want to get it out there, but it's actually one of the most important elements of catching fish, because if you're not fishing at the right depth. If you're fishing halfway through the water and the fish are feeding at the bottom, you know, you're not going to catch nearly as many fish. And as Andy said, you know, the bottom is really where it happens for most of the species you'd fish for. So you need to be careful, and you need to take the time to plumb the depth if you're fishing somewhere that you haven't fished before. You know, people, as I said, beginners tend to ignore that step, but it's kind of critical.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. Yeah, 100%. So that's just a diagram of a basic waggler setup. So that'd be what's known as a bulk setup. So you can see there we've got the locking shot around the float that holds the float in position. And then about 2/3 of the way down the line, we have what's called a bulk of shot. So that would be, generally speaking, about 80% of the capacity of the float. So, and that goes in a bulk. You would start off with your bigger shot at the top and going down to your smaller shot, just for aerodynamics, really, for the cast. And then generally speaking, below that, we'd have 1 or 2 what we call dropper shot. And they're the last final 2 shots that, so when your float settles, your last 2 dropper shots are what takes it down to that perfect level, just so as it sits right on the water surface. And we use them as telltale shot. So if you cast in, generally speaking, when you're watching your waggler, it might take 4, 5, 6 seconds to settle and sit correctly as it should do. If after 6 or 7 seconds that float's still sticking up in the air like that, what that actually means is that a fish has intercepted the bait and taken it on the way down, and it's actually holding the weight up in the water column, so it's not allowing your float to sit properly. So very often, new anglers miss hundreds and hundreds of bites because they don't understand the fact that they just think that they've lost a weight off the float, but actually it's a fish that's intercepted the bait. So, and same thing, you just strike as normal and you'd hook the fish. That often tends to happen in the summer, because what you tend to find, especially if you're loose feeding, fish will very, very often come up, particularly roach, hybrids, rudd, not so much bream, but definitely roach, hybrids and rudd. If you're loose feeding consistently throughout the day, they'll always tend to come up in the water column, particularly if we've got high pressure, because they always want to be further up in the water anyway.
Right.
So if you're loose feeding, they will come up. So that's when you start getting these type of lift bites. And generally speaking, all that tells you, us as anglers, is we need to move the float down. So we need to fish shallower, because the fish have moved up in the water column. We're going to get bites faster if it's hanging in front of the faces. So that's just a little tip there for if you do see that. That's how to read the bites on it. Have I covered everything that I've put in that? I think I have, yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And then this would be a second setup. This is called the anchor or the lift method. I've always known it as the lift method, but some people know it as the anchor method. And you can see there, you've got a waggler, but that would be a straight waggler as opposed to a bodied waggler. You would only fish this in maybe up to 8 to 10 feet of water. Any deeper than that, and it's not as effective because surface tow can affect it very badly after that. So up to 8 to 10 feet of water. And what that allows you to do is, this is absolutely a big fish method. So you use about 15 to 20% of your shot capacity around the base of your float to lock it into position at the correct depth. And then you can see on the lake bed there's a large shot that's placed maybe 5 or 6 inches away from the hook bait. And what that does is, basically, as it says in the name, it anchors that bait to the bottom. And that registers on your float, lets your float sit at the right position. That's nice and still, so it doesn't matter what happens, because what tends to happen when bigger fish come into your swim, they cause a lot of disturbance when they're feeding on the bottom. They use the pectoral fins to push forward and push the bottom up. So what happens is they get a cloud of bait up in front of them, basically. And then they'll go down and they'll feed on what's there. So what you want your bait to do, you don't want your bait coming up here, because you can hook the fish in a fin or wherever. Then you want your bait to be absolutely nailed on the bottom if there's a big fish in there. So we use it primarily for tench fishing. And I've caught hundreds of tench on this method. It really does work well. So what tends to happen then is, when a fish picks your bait up off the bottom, it registers immediately on that weight. It picks the weight up off the bottom, and your float is sat like this, and then literally within a second, your float comes right up out of the water and lays on its side, because the fish has taken the weight off of the float, and that's your that's your indication to strike at that fish. Very, very good big fish method.
Yeah, that's kind of my favorite way of fishing. I do a lot of, when I go coarse fishing, I tend to fish for tench more often than any other species. And that would be my go-to method for it. Because I think it's great. You get such positive bites from it because the float, it's not like the float is just tipping away or anything like that. It really shoots up out of the water and you definitely know you've got a fish on. So yeah, I love that method.
Yeah. And it's real heart in your mouth stuff as well. When
Yeah.
you see the little bubbles coming up around your float and then all of a sudden your float shoots up out of the water, you know you've got a big fish on.
Yeah.
So just going to go into stick float fishing now. So stick float fishing is all about running water. So you'd only ever use stick float on running water, any rivers, moving canals, things like that. There's 3 sort of main setups that you tend to use. The general setup I'd use a lot of, I'd fish what we call bolo floats, which is that type of float with a big body, a big shoulder, and it's got a lot of weight capacity. I'd use that on the Shannon a lot because the Shannon's a big, powerful river. You need to get that bait down there. So for that, you'd use a big bulker shot, maybe 2 feet away from your hook, and then with a couple of droppers underneath. And then all that does is them floats attached by rubbers, top and bottom. So you'd have a rubber there, you'd have a rubber here just under the body, and then one down at the bottom here. And that's just to hold it in place, nice and firm. Same thing with the plumbing up. You would plumb up with a long rod or on a pole, swing it out into the floor, let the lead go down until it registers, get the correct depth. And then as you're running through, what we tend to do when we're river fishing, it's a bit more of an art form than still water fishing, because on still waters, you cast your Wagner out, it sits there in your swim, and you're kind of relying on the fish being there and attracted into that zone by what you're throwing in. Whereas on a river, you can actually make your bait work for you. So by holding the float back against the floor, what you're causing your bait to do effectively is, so it travels through like this, and when you hold your float back, it lifts up in the floor like this, and then it drops back down. So you're kind of wafting the bait up in front, you know, of the fish. You can also stop your bait dead still. So if the fish are hard on the bottom, say in flooded water conditions, that's where that big flat float would come in, and you just literally just plonk it in and hold it dead tight. And sometimes I'll get you a fish when nothing else will. And then we have what's called shirt button style there, which is for fishing through the water column. If you're fishing a shallower river swim, say up to maybe 8-9 foot deep, that's got a reasonable pace to it, you can catch literally, because you're loose feeding all the time on the river. Because if you say, for instance, when you're putting bait in a lake, that bait is building the whole time. So not every bit of bait is getting eaten by them fish in front of you when you're on a lake. But as sure as eggs are eggs when you're on a river, every single bit of bait that you put in front of you after a half hour is 50, 60 yards downstream, because the flow's naturally pushing it down. So you're consistently putting bait in all day. And so what tends to happen is the fish will automatically come up and down through the water columns at different times of day, you know, because there's bait going in the whole time. So they might feed up here, they could feed down here. And the shirt button style allows you to fish the whole water column, because what you do is you're casting slightly downstream of yourself, holding you hold your rig back, so your rig actually lands in the water straight like that, but falls at a diagonal angle through your swim. So at every point as your bait's going through, it's registering on your float. So as soon as you see any little movement on your float, you're connected to a fish. It's just a real nice way of fishing. But if I had to do one method of fishing for the rest of my life, stick float fishing would be it, definitely.
Okay.
There's no finer way of catching a bag of fish, I don't think. And then the other one is, you can see the general setup there. That's kind of bigger shot going down to smaller shot. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I would say out of every 100 times I'd fish with a stick float, I'd use that 0. I would either use a bolt setup or a shirt button style. I would never use that general setup. I've found that drawing on the internet, and it's definitely not something I would use after 30 odd years of experience. But
Right.
that's just my personal preference. That's all. Also, a very important part about float fishing on a river is mending your line. So when your float's trotting downstream, if you've got any sort of a breeze, which generally speaking we do have, you will end up with a bow of line either behind your float or in front of your float, and that can pull your float offline and pull it out of the baited area and present your bait unnaturally to fish. So what we do to avoid that is we do what's called mending the line. And what that involves is basically putting your finger on the spool to stop any line coming off the spool. You're lifting the rod up in the air, taking all the line up off the surface of the river and placing the line back down behind the float. So you're kind of flicking the line over so that it rests back down behind the float. And what that does is it just allows you to keep that natural sort of flow of the bait going down and allows you a natural presentation. I think that's about it on stick float fishing. Anything that you can think of to add there, Shed?
No, I'd say that part of the reason why you have quite long rods when you're using stick floats is to allow you to mend the line, because the longer a rod that you have, the more line that you can pick up and flick. If you're trying to do it with a smaller 9-foot rod, you lose control over the float and your ability to control it. So you tend to go for longer rods when you're doing that type of fishing, just to allow you that extra control that you need when you're fishing in a river.
Yeah,
Definitely. Pole fishing. This is probably something that I would do about 80% of my fishing in competitions is pole fishing, purely because it's just such an accurate method. There's no other method that even comes close to it for accuracy. Basically, it allows you, it's a long carbon fishing pole. There's no reel. Normally, the top 2 or 3 sections are fitted with this stuff, which is a form of latex elastic, and it comes in different grades, different strengths, different thicknesses, and all differing colors. And you match up your strength of elastic to the species of fish that you're going to be catching. And basically what you do is you play the fish on that elastic. So you attach your rig, which your rig is your float, line, hook, and weights. You attach that to the end of the pole via a small little connector, which I've got here somewhere. So these, I don't know if you'll be able to see that very clearly on screen. These tiny little Stomfo connectors, they're called. We put like a looper line around it, and we pull that down tight, and that locks all your rig in position. And then that allows you to play the fish on the elastic. And like I said, the beauty about pole fishing is you can put your bait on a 6pence. Whether you're fishing at 3 meters, because whips are made as short as 3 meters or 2 meters even, or you can be fishing, most modern carbon poles now are made, the standard sort of lengths are between 13 and 16 meters. So you can fish at a full 16 meters and literally drop your bait on a 6pence and put it in the exact same spot every time. Right. You know, you pick a marker on the far bank and you can put a piece of tape on the butt of the pole so it tells you you're at the exact same position every time when you're holding it. And it allows you to be super, super accurate. And what that allows you to do is create massive competition in your swim for the feed. So basically you can feed a really small area of your, you feed a bigger area to start with to get the fish in, but then you concentrate your feed in a smaller and smaller area with a richer and richer food content. And what that does is it causes the bigger fish to push the small fish out of the way and compete for the bait.
Yeah.
And then, so it allows you to hook the better specimens that are there. That's what I like about the pole fishing. I also like the fact that when you're fishing the long pole, it's a bit of an art form. It took me about 10 years to perfect, to get it right. But when you get it right, it's a very rewarding method to fish. The whip is an absolutely outstanding bit of kit. And like I say, they can be very, very cheap. You can get whips in tackle shops. For a whip with a rig and a pint of maggots might only cost you 15 or 20 euros in the tackle shop.
Wow.
You know, but they can be, you can go silly money with them if you wanted to, you know.
Yes,
They can be several hundred euros. But a proficient whip angler can catch over 100 fish an hour. You know, if them fish are in front of him, I've actually seen lads on the continent. There's the 4 times world champion, Thomas Walter. I watched him fish a match for Bleak, and he had 4,500 fish in a 4-hour match.
Holy smoke.
Yeah, it was something ridiculous, like 80 pound of bleak. Now, when you're talking, bleak are only this big, and they weigh maybe a quarter to a half of an ounce, and he had 80 pound of them in a 4-hour match. I mean, it's just a ridiculous way of fishing. It was just a blur. His hand speed was just a blur when he were going, like, you know, but unbelievable to watch. Another good thing about pole fishing is it allows you to use lighter lines than you ordinarily would do. So if I was using a feeder and having to throw a big feeder out into the river or a lake that's carrying a load of particle feed, I need a line that's strong enough to be able to throw that feeder out there. Whereas if I'm pole fishing, I only need a line that's strong enough to cope with the fish that I'm fishing for, if you know what I mean, because you're only dropping a light rig into the water. You're not putting any weight on it in the cast. So it allows you to use smaller hooks, lighter line diameters. And once you get proficient at pole fishing, it allows you to really take things, you know, you can catch big fish on very, very small lines, which again gives you the added edge in competition, because you're looking to outdo the guy next to you. So, you know, if he's fishing a heavier line, likelihood is you're going to get more bites than him. But then the major downside to pole fishing is it limits your distance. You know, as I say, most major poles on the market now are only made up to a distance of 16 meters. So if you turn up to a lake and all the fish are out at 40 and 50 meters, your pole's no good to you. You know, you need a feeder rod or you need a Wagner rod. So it's not a be all and end all. It's certainly a great tool to have in your possession, but it's not something that I would say is a necessity. Certainly, rod and reel fishing is where I would be starting anybody out, definitely. But it's just a touch on it, that's all. Yourself, Shane?
Yeah, well, unlike Andy, I actually do 0% of my fishing as pole fishing. It's just not something. It's not something I ever took up. I bought a pole when I was much younger, and it was a poor quality one, and it was very floppy, and it was difficult to use and difficult to hold in the wind, and it was heavy, and I just didn't like it, and I never really got into it after that. So I defer to Andy on all things pole. One thing that I would say that is also a bit of a downside to a pole is the expense. They're very expensive to buy. The good ones in particular are very expensive to buy. So if you're starting off on your fishing journey, it's probably not the place to go and to start off with feeder or Wagner type fishing. And then if you're bitten by the bug and you want to develop further, then pole fishing is probably the next step.
Yeah. This is just a little bit about pole rigs. Just to say again, you can either make your own, like I say, there's lots of them there, and we can tie them up. All you need is your lead shot, your hooks, your line, and we store them on rig winders. Once we've made them up, store them on these winders, and they're good to go, good to use again for the next day out. That's another thing that I like about pole fishing is the fact that your rigs go on the winder. Literally, when you get to the bank, take the pole out the bag, put the pole together, put your rig on the end, plumb your swim up, and you're ready to fish. So it's very quick to get going.
Yes.
But also, as well as making your own, they can be bought ready-made in the shops as well. And again, they're not particularly expensive. You can get them for as little as €2 or €3 for a rig. So, you know, if people don't know how to make their own, again, there's lots of videos on YouTube and stuff to be able to make them, but there's lots of choice in the tackle shops. So now we're on to feeder fishing, which is probably what Ireland is most well known for, coarse fishing wise anyway. That's certainly what I came over and started to do years ago when I used to come over as a visiting angler. That's one of a recent trip of ours there, Shane, isn't it? Up at that lake. Yeah, we had a good day there.
We did, yeah. We caught a lot of fish.
Yeah. Types of swim feeders, lots of different swim feeders for lots of different tools. Not going to go through them all because we could be here all day. We'll just go through the main ones that people tend to use when they're starting out. And that's the cage feeder, the open end feeder, the maggot feeder, the window feeder, and then for specimen anglers, there's what's known as the method feeder. Now, swim feeders are a relatively new invention. They only really came about in the 1970s. Prior to that, it were all fishing with lead bombs, Arsley bombs, as they were known back then, and big catapults firing balls of breadcrumb out into the lakes, which was a feat in itself. It took a lot of skill to be accurate with them big old catapults back then. But thankfully for the likes of me, times have moved on and it's much easier to be accurate with a swim feeder now. Certainly the most recent sort of step in feeders is you can see on a lot of them feeders now, the kind of what we call weight forward. So they have a band of weight around the bottom of the feeder. And what that allows the feeder to do is fly very, very true, very straight, even in bad weather conditions. So if you've got a bad crosswind and you were fishing the old type feeders with the lead on one side, what tends to happen is the wind will cop a hold of it and it'll blow it offline, and you could end up with this cast going here, this cast going there, another cast going there, you know, so you're not concentrating your bait in one area. Whereas with the new type feeders, they will go literally dead straight. Don't matter how bad the weather conditions are. So that's one big plus to them. The differences between the main feeders are the cage feeder is the one at the top in the guy's hand. And that's just a wire cage. Basically on that one, we'd use that in fairly shallow water. What you're trying to do with that is that's releasing particles. As soon as that hits the water, it's starting to release little particles and it's forming a column of particles falling down through the water. And then most of the sort of main concentration of feed leaves the feeder when it hits the bottom. But you're trying to form that. It's almost an enticement for the fish to say, look what's down here, you know. So that's the cage feeder. Then the open end feeder would be the one to the right of that. And that's with the old type open end feeder with the lead on one side. What that generally tends to be for is your deeper water when you don't want much bait going down through the water column. You want pretty much all your bait to come out once it hits the bottom or once it's near the bottom. So that's what we use them for. Then you've got the maggot feeder, which you can see in the middle there, the one with all the little holes in and the black cap. All we do is we pop the black cap off, fill that with maggots, pop the cap back on, throw it out into the lake, and then the maggots just wriggle out of the feeder, and that, you know, that feeds you swim naturally that way. The window feeder is, again, a relatively new invention, brought to Ireland, I think, about 15 years ago by some of the England lads, some of the English team and the lads from the Netherlands. They invented it. And what that is, it's a modified maggot feeder almost. You can see they've just literally chopped a window out of the maggot feeder. And what that allows you to do in even in a pleasure fishing situation, if you're catching lots of fish and you want to get back in quickly, it allows you just to push the feeder through the feed. It fills up automatically in your hand, and then you literally just put in a little bit of ground bait on the top just to keep the feed in the feeder on the cast. Throw that out into your swim, and it starts to release feed once it hits the bottom. Very, very devastating method over here, the window feeder. It's a way of getting lots and lots of particle feed in your swim very quickly. And then the method feeder is great fun, really, really good fun. What that involves is you can see there the feeder on the left hand side, and then that's the mold for the feeder on the right hand side. What you do is you put your hook bait into the mold, and then you fill the mold with ground bait or pellets or whatever your mix is, and you push the feeder down then into the mold and clamp it down nice and tight, and that forms the ball around your hook bait with your hook bait right on top of the ball. You cast your bait out into the water, the fish come in, they start pulling the ball apart, they find your hook bait, lift up, and the bites that you get on the method feeder are savage.
Wow.
Yeah, really, really hard biting fish on the method feeder because they're pulling the weight of the feeder. They're kind of hooking themselves against the weight of the feeder. It's known as what we're known as a bolt rig, but it's very popular amongst specimen anglers. I've used it myself for bream fishing. It's good fun for bream because bream they can be finicky biters at the best of times, but if you get them feeding well and you go out on the method feeder, it can be really good fun. And then that photo there is basically when things go right. As it says, when all the angling gods align and the conditions are right, the feeder can be unbeatable.
There's the proof.
Yeah, that's it. You know, you're catching big fish, generally speaking, on the feeder because you're chucking a long way out into the lake. You're putting big baits in front of them. And yeah, they were not too far off £200 between them two nets.
Wow.
Now, I'll admit here that I didn't catch them all. Shane
That's very big of it.
I was wondering where you're going to admit that. Yeah. I was just going to add on the feeder fishing. Sometimes, Andy, you'll arrive along, won't you? And before you even start fishing, you'll fill up that feeder, you know, maybe 20 or 30 times and fire it out without even trying to catch a fish. So you'll cast it out and you'll reel it back in again and cast it out to build up an area of feed before you start fishing. And one important thing to remember when you're using the feeder, you're trying to get the feeder into pretty much the same place every time. Right. And a way that we use now to do that is that most reels you buy today have a clip on them, and you can clip the line so that it stops you from overcasting, so that you make sure that you're hitting the same distance every time. And you'll hear feeder anglers talking about how many turns they're fishing out, and that means how many turns of the reel that they're fishing in, and you can judge things like that, you know. So accuracy is extremely important, isn't it, Andy, when you're feeder fishing?
Very.
You don't want to spread your bait over 20 square yards. You want to spread it over 2 square yards if possible.
Yeah. And just another little tip on that one, like Shane was saying, keeping things tight, is always pick a far bank marker. So it's brilliant. You do need to know how many turns you're fishing at and that, but always pick a far bank marker. So what I normally do is I'll pick out either the tallest tree or maybe a telegraph post or a house on the far bank or something that's not going to move throughout the day.
Yeah.
And just aim at the middle of that for the day. And that's the best way of keeping things nice and tight. Yeah.
Excellent.
So I think, yeah, that's everything sort of covered as much as I could within the given time frame, Frank.
Oh, listen, that's fantastic. That's a huge amount of information. Just to recap, you don't need a license, or you do need a rod license? There is
only, as far as I'm aware, now correct me if I'm wrong, Shane, I think it's only the Midlands angling permit, which would be the River Suck and the Inny, and any of its tributaries that you need a license for. But if you're, generally speaking, anywhere else, you don't need a license.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Pretty much. I think in Escara as well, don't you need a permit for?
Oh, I think down in Cork, yeah.
But the majority, you know, it's kind of tricky because there are different types of rivers, and you can get yourself in a little bit of trouble if you were to go fishing with worms in a salmon river because you need a license to fish for salmon. But if you are to look at Ireland and look at all of the Shannon system, and apart from the Suck, as Andy said, and all of those lakes that you have up in Cavan and Leitrim and in Clare as well, I mean, there's literally thousands of them. You don't need a permit or a license to fish any of those. So it's one of the most accessible types of fishing in that sense. And the canals as well. The canals are always handy too, because they go through some of the urban environments, including Dublin. You don't need a license or permit to fish them.
Very good. Very good. And sorry, one other thing was you always recommend checking in with your local bait shop. You mightn't always be, I mean, I suppose you're not going to pick up maggots if you're traveling. You want to get them locally anyway, ideally.
Yeah, I mean, maggots will keep, like, you know, if you keep them on a cool floor in the shed or something in the bait tub, they'll be fine for a night or two. And what I tend to find is I would often be setting off early to a place, so I will get my bait the day before.
Yeah.
But yeah, by all means, if you're going somewhere and you can get your bait locally, you're going to get the best advice locally. If you go into a local tackle shop, as opposed to going into one back where you live and
Yes.
you've gone 50 miles to your fishing venue, you
Yeah.
might not know about it, whereas your local man will know exactly what's been caught that week on there, you know?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Exactly, and the local guys will know. They'll have people coming in and out to them all the time, so they'll know if particular areas have been fished during the week. And you'll often find that because anglers are fishing the same areas and throwing in feed into those areas will keep fishing well. So if they can point you in the direction, say, oh, there was a gang fishing there during the week, if you go there, you're more likely to catch than if you just go randomly to anywhere,
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say if you possibly can go in and talk to the local tackle shop, because they'll set you right in terms of where to go.
Very good. Right. Listen, that's where time is up. Unfortunately, we could spend hours. Andy, Shane, thank you very, very much. We look forward to. There's a huge interest in the fishing and the discussions, and for those shedders out there, we're always encouraging you to get in touch with the IFI. They have a great education and training centre, and there's lots can be done within sheds, whether it's group shed fishing or the lads coming out and talking about fly tying and rod upcycling. There's so much to be done. And it's so much to enjoy, and it's always good. Any time spent around fishing, talking about fishing, it is good for your mental health. It's good for everything, and it's good for the people you leave at home too, because they know you're out enjoying yourself, and that's always a good thing. So listen, I'm going to say thank you very much again, Andy, Shane. Look forward to talking to you soon, and thanks very much for today. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks very much for having us, Frank.
Yeah,
Take care.
thanks for everyone for listening.
Take care. Thank you.
See you now. Bye.
All the best. Bye.